Recovery is usually a story of motion. Lift vectors, cut paths, applied force, and the slow work of dragging history back to the surface. But in the coastal lowlands of Madang Province, the engineering problem is the opposite: restraint. The wreckage of the Nakajima Ki-49 Helen, manufacture number 3110, sits behind a hard legal and ethical firewall. Under strict heritage conditions set by the Papua New Guinea National Museum and Art Gallery and the wider cultural property framework, this is a forensic survey, not a salvage operation. Our task is simple and absolute: identify the machine and document its decay without disturbing a single rivet of the scene. The aircraft rests on the floor of an active coconut plantation in the Bai area. This environment creates a preservation paradox. Unlike a wreck buried in anaerobic mud or frozen in a glacier, the Helen is fully exposed to the atmosphere and the daily agricultural cycle. High humidity, equatorial heat, and falling canopy debris work the aluminum skin day after day. The site is accessible, yet the airframe is physically trapped by vegetation threaded through its fuselage sections. Our primary constraint is a war grave protocol, an operational limit adopted when human remains are potential or confirmed. It changes the wreck from a collection of aluminum and steel into a protected volume. We treat the airframe as a sanctuary: no hatches pried open, no soil disturbed beneath the cockpit, no fuselage cut to chase a data plate. The survey relies on external observation and non-invasive documentation, and the limit of access is the outer surface of the skin. If a serial number is hidden by corrosion or soil, we record what is visible and accept the gaps rather than disturb the interior context. This discipline is critical because the aircraft is slowly disappearing. When aviation historian Charles Darby surveyed the site in 1974, the airframe was more intact, at least as later notes describe it. 50 years of exposure have accelerated the metal's consumption. The plantation is aggressive. Vines and root systems apply steady mechanical pressure to thin aluminum structures, warping geometry and snapping fasteners. The team has to navigate that biological entanglement without adding damage. We are witnesses to a slow-motion structural collapse we are not authorized to interrupt. The identification of this machine rests on earlier documentation. The manufacture number, 3110, was recorded on the airframe in prior surveys and can be reconfirmed today where it remains visible without disturbance. That number ties the wreck to a Nakajima Ki-49-2, known to Allied crews as the Helen. But the trail ends at the factory floor. The bomber's operational history is fragmented. We can place it in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, yet the unit markings on the vertical stabilizer, the symbols that would point to a specific flying regiment or sentai, have become the most contested absence on the site. The survey process here requires a shift in mindset. We are not hunting lift points or calculating sling loads. We are reading forensics at human pace: stencil edges under moss, a bulkhead deformation that speaks to impact, a scatter of fragments that defines the boundary of the event. Every step around the wreck is deliberate, designed to avoid crushing the debris field spreading out from the main fuselage. The ground itself is evidence. Leaving the wreck in place is not an admission of defeat. It is a trade we make with open eyes. In the plantation, the government of Papua New Guinea preserves the site's context. The aircraft lies where its energy was spent in the late war period in New Guinea, even if the precise date of loss remains unconfirmed. Moving it to a museum could slow the corrosion, but it would break the integrity of the scene. We trade metal for meaning. And the meaning is fading as fast as the paint, because the unit markings that could link this serial to a crew and a mission are being erased one rainy season at a time. We can name the machine. The men remain out of reach, trapped between missing paint and restricted access. The aircraft's condition is defined by the physics of its arrival. To understand why it cannot be recovered, we have to reconstruct the crash as an energy management problem. In flight, an aircraft is stored kinetic and potential energy. In a forced landing into a coconut plantation, that energy has to be spent in seconds. The ground becomes an uneven break, not through wheels and brakes, but through aluminum skin and main spars. The deceleration is violent beyond what the airframe fasteners were built to survive. The wreckage of manufacture number 3110 is separated into 3 major sections. This is not random scattering, it is the result of breakup dynamics. This concept describes how a semi-monocoque structure fails under impact loads. The fuselage of a bomber is essentially a stiffened tube designed to handle aerodynamic forces, which are distributed across the skin. It is not designed to handle the point loads of colliding with trees or the ground. When the aircraft hits, the kinetic energy travels through the longitudinal stringers like a shockwave. It moves until it encounters a discontinuity in stiffness, a heavy bulkhead, a turret ring, or a wing root. At that boundary, the stress spikes and the metal shears. The aircraft snaps at its strongest points because those are the points that refuse to flex. In the case of the Ki-49, this breakup sequence was driven by a specific internal configuration. The center wing section of the Helen was a complex piece of engineering. It carried multiple fuel cells and dense internal systems. To accommodate this volume, the structure is heavily compartmentalized, with openings and routing paths that can interrupt clean load continuity. Under the immense torque of a high-energy impact, that kind of compartmentalized center section can become a failure boundary. The rivets can fail in shear, and the wing assembly can detach from the fuselage. The structural spine of the aircraft was severed. The engines also played a decisive role in this dissection. The Helen was powered by two Nakajima Ha-109 radial engines, each rated around 1,450 horsepower depending on setting and conditions. More importantly, each engine was a dense mass of steel mounted on the leading edge of a lightweight alloy wing. When the airframe decelerated on impact, the engine's momentum carried forward like kinetic hammers, twisting mounts and ripping nacelles free. That loss of mass at the wing roots helped drive the catastrophic segmentation of the fuselage. This shattered geometry is the technical reason recovery is classified as impossible. A lift operation needs a continuous load path, a way to pass slings under structure and transfer weight to a crane without crushing the skin. On an intact airframe, stress can ride the keel and longerons. Here, those paths are gone. The fuselage is no longer a tube, it is a set of open shells. Any attempt to lift would force the sections to fold under their own weight. We would not be recovering an aircraft. We would be tearing it apart. The local oral history suggests this energy release was the end of a dogfight. The presence of defensive ammunition and the position of the wreck supports a high-speed, low-altitude entry. The pilot did not stall the aircraft into the trees, he drove it in. The violence of that arrival stripped the machine of its flight capability and its structural unity. It remains where it stopped, a collection of 3 parts that can never be rejoined. However, this destruction has exposed internal details that are usually hidden. The severed tail section, now lying independent of the cockpit, presents a silhouette that does not match the standard profile of a Mitsubishi bomber. The crash broke the plane, but in doing so, it isolated the geometry we need to prove exactly what it is. The primary challenge of surveying a wreck in dense vegetation is that the jungle destroys perspective. When an aircraft is intact on a runway, its lines are clear. But when it is disarticulated in a coconut plantation, the foliage creates a visual noise that breaks up the outline. We cannot see the aircraft as a whole system. We are forced to identify it by the geometry of its components. This restriction leads us to the engineering discipline of diagnostic geometry. Diagnostic geometry asserts that while skin corrodes and paint fades, structural hardpoints remain invariant. Every aircraft type carries a skeletal fingerprint dictated by function. Instead of chasing broad silhouettes, we read the fixed geometry, rivet line spacing on a main spar, the mounting flange that once held an instrument panel, the hardpoints that do not change even when glass shatters and panels vanish. Those truths can identify a machine even when half of it is missing or buried under root systems. At the buy site, this discipline is required to resolve a common historical confusion. Casual observers and tourists often misidentify this wreckage as a Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Allies as the Betty. It is an understandable error. Both the Betty and the aircraft at buy are twin-engine Japanese bombers with cigar-shaped fuselages and mid-wing configurations. In the mud and shadows, they look identical. However, diagnostic geometry separates them instantly. The difference is not in the engines, but in the defense. The Nakajima Ki-49 Helen was one of the early Japanese Army bombers designed with a dedicated manned tail defense position, built around a heavy structural ring at the extreme aft of the fuselage to support the mechanism and the gunner. The Betty's tail defense arrangement varied by variant, and it did not always require the same kind of aft-ring structure. When we examine the severed tail section at Bai, that heavy ring geometry is present. It is a definitive structural signature. The geometry confirms what the paint no longer can. This is a Helen, not a Betty. The internal volume of the fuselage further confirms this identity. The Ki-49 was designated as a heavy bomber, but this label is misleading if judged by payload alone. Its bomb load was only 1,000 kilograms, comparable to lighter aircraft. The weight was invested in survivability and crew density. The Helen was designed to carry 8 crew members, a large number for a twin-engine platform. This requirement dictated a wider fuselage diameter to accommodate the stations for the gunners. The survey records the mounting points for this defensive network. We identify the dorsal position, designed to accommodate a cannon installation on some variants. We locate hard points for heavy machine gun mounts in the nose, tail, and ventral positions, provisions that could be fitted differently across production blocks and field retrofits. These weapons are heavy. They require reinforced mounting brackets to absorb the recoil forces. By mapping these reinforcement plates, we can reconstruct the defensive sphere of the aircraft. The Betty had a different gun layout and different recoil path structures. The wreckage at Bai speaks the language of the Ki-49's blueprints. This visual confirmation locks the identification of serial number 3110 without moving a single leaf. We can match the manufacturer number to the airframe's architecture. But the second question, who operated it, hits a hard limit. The tail section proves the type, yet the vertical stabilizer is blank where the unit marking should be. That absence is the forensic gap. The machine's design speaks clearly, but the group of aviators behind it remains unnamed. The greatest threat to the evidence at Bai is not the local population or the casual tourist. It is the chemical reaction occurring at the molecular level. The wreckage of manufacturer number 3110 is subjected to a relentless environmental attack known as corrosion chemistry. This mechanism governs the lifespan of aluminum alloys in a tropical setting. Under normal conditions, aluminum forms a thin oxide layer that seals the metal from oxygen. But in a coconut plantation, the ground is covered in decaying organic matter. This vegetation holds moisture against the skin and releases organic acids into the soil. This creates a wet, acidic poultice that clings to the airframe. The moisture acts as an electrolyte, turning the aircraft into a low-voltage battery. The electrons flow from the aluminum skin to the steel fasteners and the steel armor plates, causing the aluminum to sacrifice itself. This process is accelerated by the heat. We see the result in the pitting of the wing surfaces and the exfoliation of the spar caps. The metal is not just rusting, it is dissolving. This chemical decay is particularly tragic because it attacks the thin layers of paint that hold the aircraft's specific history. We are searching for the unit markings on the tail, but the paint is the first casualty of the jungle. Once the bond between the primer and the metal is breached by oxidation, the paint flakes off, taking the unit code with it. We are left with a ghost image, a variation in surface texture that suggests where a number once was but is no longer legible. Despite this degradation, the survey identifies components that reveal the design philosophy of the machine. The Ki-49 was officially named the Donryu, which translates to Storm Dragon. The name was a psychological weapon intended to project aggression and invulnerability. However, the debris field reveals the mechanical reality behind the name. We find remnants of steel armor plating, 5 millimeters thick, protecting the pilot and gunner positions. This was a significant departure from previous Japanese designs like the Betty, which famously sacrificed protection for range. The Storm Dragon was built to take punishment. Yet this protection came with a heavy performance penalty. The armor and the self-sealing fuel tanks added significant mass to the airframe. To maintain range, the designers were forced to limit the offensive capacity. The survey confirms the bomb bay dimensions and the rack hardware correspond to a maximum payload of only 1,000 kilograms. This creates a technical contradiction. The aircraft was large, heavy, and armored, but it delivered a bomb load equivalent to a much smaller single-engine aircraft. The weight was invested in keeping the crew alive, not in destroying the target. This material evidence explains why the wreck exists in 3 sections. The heavy armor and the complex internal structure made the airframe rigid. When it impacted the plantation, it did not crumple gradually like a modern car. It shattered. The very features designed to protect the crew from machine gun fire, the hard armor plates, created stress concentrations that snapped the fuselage during the crash. Under the same no-touch constraint, we cannot arrest the corrosion, no inhibitors, no relocation to a climate-controlled hangar. We can only document the storm dragon as it returns to the soil, knowing the 5mm armor will outlast the aluminum and leave a steel skeleton in the dirt. The data we capture now may be the final record. The unit code is likely already gone, erased by the plantation's organic acids, so the decision ahead is not technical, it is ethical. Violate the site to chase a vanishing answer, or accept that the jungle will finish what the American fighters started. The investigation now arrives at a binary decision point. We have executed a forensic survey of the wreck, mapped the debris field, analyzed the structural breaks, and confirmed the airframe as a Nakajima Ki-49, manufacturer number 3110. But the final piece, the specific flying regiment that operated it, remains missing. In a standard recovery, that gap would trigger escalation, excavation under the cockpit, soil sifting for artifacts, lab sampling for pigment traces. Here, we do the opposite. We stop. This decision is driven by in situ preservation. The idea that an object's meaning collapses when its context is stripped away. Extract the Helen and you may gain clean aluminum, but you lose the crash event itself, the measured relationship between severed tail, crushed wing root, and the trees that took the impact. What remains would be an artifact, not an incident. Left in place, the wreck and the ground it struck stay fused into one record. The choice to accept the unknown unit classification is also supported by a specific anomaly on the tail. While the unit insignia is missing, the vertical stabilizer bears the number 110. This is not a standard factory serial, nor is it a confirmed unit code. It reads like a handwritten, uncoded designator, but its meaning is unverified. One possibility is that it was a transient identifier applied during movement, replacement, or depot handling. It is also possible it was added later, outside any formal system. If this hypothesis is correct, no amount of digging or cutting will reveal a badge that was never applied. Therefore, the engineering trade-off is clear. The cost of physical intervention is the destruction of the site's context and the violation of the preservation laws. The potential gain is zero because the evidence we seek likely does not exist. We accept the limit of the visible data. We certify the identification of the airframe, but we decline to force a result on the unit identity. This pivot defines the outcome of the project. We are not recovering a warbird. We are validating a monument. The Papua New Guinea National Museum and Art Gallery is the custodian authority for cultural heritage stewardship, and this wreck falls within that protective framework. Our survey confirms that leaving the site undisturbed is warranted. The wreckage is stable enough to remain as a landmark provided the vegetation is managed. We have answered the question of what is it? We have answered the question of how did it die? We accept that we cannot answer who was it without inventing facts that the metal does not support. The decision is locked, the tools are packed away, the perimeter is left undisturbed. The survey of number 3110 is concluded as a success, not because we retrieved the object, but because we defined it. The metal remains silent, slowly sinking into the plantation floor. But while the airframe has told us everything it can, the human story of this crash has survived in a different format. Just beyond the boundary of the coconut plantation, the local village holds a memory of the event that the archives missed. The technical file on manufacturer number 3110 is now closed. We have successfully identified the airframe, documented its structural failure modes, and established the chemical horizon of its survival. However, the survey reveals a discrepancy between the sterile language of the engineering ledgers and the local memory of the event. This wreck is not just a data point in a Ministry of Munitions table. It is the physical anchor for a specific, violent historical sequence that was never written down in the official mission reports. To reconcile these sources, we apply the principle of chain of evidence. In a forensic recovery, this concept defines the unbroken link between a physical object found in the field and a specific event in the timeline. Usually, this chain is built with paper, flight plans, loss reports, and after-action summaries. But in the case of the Helen, the paper trail is broken. The unit records were likely destroyed in the retreat or lost in the chaotic administration of the late war period. Here, the chain of evidence is maintained not by archives, but by the oral tradition of the village elders who live on the plantation boundary. The local account describes a dogfight involving 3 aircraft, 2 Japanese bombers and 1 American fighter. This aligns with the physical evidence of the crash trajectory and the expended defensive ammunition found in the fuselage. However, the oral record adds a grim termination to the sequence. It alleges that the American pilot, having been shot down in the exchange, managed to swim to shore near the plantation and was killed shortly after reaching the beach. This claim is preserved as local memory, but it is not independently verified by surviving archives in our file. This narrative transforms the wreckage of the Ki-49. It is no longer just a sample of Nakajima engineering. It becomes a sensitive marker for unresolved human loss. This reinforces the decision to treat the site with the strict caution of a potential war grave. Minimal disturbance, full documentation, and respect for what may still lie within the perimeter. The preservation of the wreckage in situ ensures that the physical anchor of this engagement remains visible. If we were to remove the aircraft for a museum display in a foreign capital, we would sever the connection between the machine and the location where the human cost was paid. The wreckage acts as the witness. Since Charles Darby first documented the site in 1974, the Helen has endured more than 50 years of tropical weather, shifting from potential salvage to protected cultural heritage. The Papua New Guinea National Museum and Art Gallery monitor sites like this not to restore them, but to keep them legible in the landscape of conflict. Our survey adds a digital layer to that stewardship. By building a photogrammetric model, we preserve the wreck's geometry before corrosion chemistry advances further. We cannot stop the oxidation, we can freeze the data. The mission outcome is classified as a success. Serial 3110 is no longer anonymous. Its breakup dynamics are mapped, and its material limits are on record. The unit markings did not survive, and the 110 tail number remains an unverified anomaly, more like a transient handling mark than a confirmed badge. So we end where the rules demanded we begin. No recovery, no disturbance, no invented certainty. The team withdraws and leaves the site exactly as it was found, preserving the evidence for the next generation of historians.